ceremonial oversight, and the speed of answers. There is a quiet moment that arrives in every organization that adopts automation at scale. Nothing breaks, no alarms, the dashboards glow, the forms still get filled, the approvals still get clicked, the checklists still get checked, but the center of gravity shifts. Oversight used to mean, I looked, I understood, I tested. Now it can mean, I witnessed the process occur. The proxy problem enters without announcement. We begin to treat the visible steps as evidence of the invisible understanding. The stakes are not theatrical, they are ordinary and persistent. When tools can supply answers faster than humans can verify, oversight can become a ceremony, performed to satisfy expectations, while the real work of accountability drains away. The question is not whether we will automate. The question is when our oversight becomes a costume that fits the shape of control while leaving control behind. Today's scope is narrow and practical. Checklists, approvals, sign-offs, and the social meaning of responsible when the system is doing the work at machine speed and the human is asked to confirm at human speed. Oversight becomes ceremonial when incentives reward the appearance of verification more reliably than they reward the reality of understanding, and proxies for accountability drift into substitutes for it. I will not claim that automation is inherently corrupting or that humans were ever perfectly attentive. I will not claim that checklists and approvals are useless. I will not claim that every automated system is destined for failure. I will claim something more uncomfortable and more testable. When the cost of real verification rises above the value assigned to it by the incentive structure, oversight becomes a performance, sometimes sincere, sometimes tired, built to satisfy a workflow rather than to constrain risk. We will name the mechanics of that drift. We will look at how it happens even with competent people and good intentions, and we will leave space at the end because systems rarely offer clean endings. We need a few terms, plain and sharp, because vague language lets incentives hide. First term, automation. Here, automation is any tool or process that produces outputs, recommendations, decisions, classifications, summaries, approvals, faster than a human could produce them, and often at a scale a human cannot match. It is not only robots or complex models, it includes scripts that pre-fill forms, systems that route tickets, templates that generate text, and engines that flag risk. The key attribute is speed and volume. The tool can generate more answers per hour than a person can meaningfully inspect. Second term, oversight. Oversight is the set of human actions intended to constrain mistakes, abuse, and drift in a process. It is review, approval, audit, sign-off, and escalation. Oversight is not the same as responsibility. Oversight is a constraint placed on a system, and constraints can be real or decorative. Third term, verification. Verification is the act of checking that an output corresponds to reality or to a justified rule. It is not merely reading, it is testing. A verification step changes your confidence because you inspected evidence, reproduced a result, challenged an assumption, or examined a sample in a way that could actually catch an error. A person skimming a report is not verification if the skim cannot detect failure. Fourth term, proxy. A proxy is a measurable or observable stand-in for something we care about but cannot directly observe at scale. Completed checklist is a proxy for safe procedure. Manager approval is a proxy for accountable decision. Model accuracy score is a proxy for reliable outcomes in the messy world. Proxies are not lies, they are shortcuts. The danger is that shortcuts become destinations. Now, an important distinction. Metric versus meaning. A metric is a number or status we can track. Completion rate, turnaround time, error count, approval time, number of escalations, percentage of items reviewed. Meaning is what we want the system to do in the world: prevent harm, preserve quality, respect constraints, keep promises, maintain trust, allocate effort wisely. The metric is a handle on meaning, but it is not the thing itself. When the handle becomes the goal, the system learns to optimize the handle. A simple example. A checklist item says confirm address matches record. A human might click confirmed because the tool already filled it and the field looks plausible. The metric shows compliance. The meaning, ensuring the address is correct, may not be satisfied. The checklist item is a proxy. The click is a proxy for the proxy. Another example. An approval queue requires a supervisor to sign off on decisions generated by a tool. If the tool generates 500 decisions a day, and the supervisor has time to review 50 deeply. What does the signature on the other 450 mean? It can mean, I am accountable, or it can mean, I kept the line moving. The same signature can represent two different realities, and incentives decide which reality becomes normal. Let's name our assumptions explicitly. Assumption 1. Human attention is limited and costly. Oversight consumes attention, and attention competes with production, speed, and other obligations. Assumption 2. Automation changes the ratio between output and review capacity. When output grows faster than verification capacity, the system must either slow down, increase verification resources, or reduce verification depth. If it cannot slow down and cannot add resources, it will reduce depth, even if nobody says so out loud. Assumption 3. Organizations use proxies because they must coordinate. Checklists, approvals, and audits exist because we cannot directly observe everyone's intent and competence, and we cannot independently verify every step every time. Assumption 4. Incentives operate whether or not we discuss them. The fact that people have good intentions does not remove the pressure exerted by deadlines, performance evaluations, and social expectations about being efficient. With these terms and assumptions, we can approach the core question: when does oversight become ceremonial rather than real? Oversight is real when it can meaningfully change outcomes. It catches errors, blocks bad decisions, improves decisions, or triggers deeper investigation. Oversight is ceremonial when it primarily signals that a process was followed, without retaining the power, practical power, to detect or correct failures. Ceremony is not necessarily dishonest. Ceremony can be the residue of a once useful constraint that no longer fits the speed of the system. It can also be a social shield, a way to show that accountability exists somewhere, even when nobody has the time or mandate to enact it. One more distinction matters: accountability versus blame. Accountability in a disciplined sense is the ability to trace decisions to agents who had the authority and capacity to change those decisions, along with clear records of what they knew and what they could reasonably have verified. Blame is what happens when accountability is vague and outcomes are bad. Ceremonial oversight often produces blame because it creates signatures without capacity, names attached to decisions that could not be meaningfully reviewed. So we will not ask, did someone sign? We will ask, could that signature have constrained the outcome? If not, the oversight is already drifting toward ceremony. The core paradox is simple and persistent. The more we measure and enforce oversight steps, the more we risk replacing judgment with compliance. And the more we automate decisions, the more we tempt ourselves to treat the existence of a review step as proof that review occurred. This is where incentives do their quiet work. A system does not need malice to become hollow. It needs only misaligned rewards. Consider the first incentive loop: throughput and reputational safety. Loop A: the tool increases throughput. The organization raises expectations for throughput. The cost of slowing down becomes social and professional. Reviewers learn that keeping the line moving is rewarded. Approvals become faster and less substantive. The tool's outputs face less resistance. Throughput rises further. Notice what is happening. Oversight is not abolished. It is kept, but it is transformed. It becomes a step that protects the story of control. The reviewer becomes a frictionless conduit. Now the second incentive loop: auditability and checkbox compliance. Loop B: leadership wants evidence of responsibility. The system creates logs, checklists, and approvals. Compliance becomes easy to count. Performance management rewards high compliance and low friction. Teams optimize for completing the measurable steps. Verification becomes whatever satisfies the audit trail. The logs look cleaner, even if the underlying reality is messier. The system learns what will be rewarded, not truth, but defensible artifacts. Oversight becomes a file, not a function. Here is the paradox stated in one line: what you measure, you serve, but what you serve gets distorted. In practice, this distortion shows up as proxy drift. The proxy, checklist completion, approval count, review coverage, becomes the target. Once the proxy becomes the target, it stops being a good measure of the underlying meaning. Let's make the drift concrete. A checklist is introduced after a mistake. It is meant to prevent recurrence. At first, it is taken seriously because the pain is recent and the cost of failure is salient. Then automation arrives and fills fields, highlights recommended actions, and pre-checks boxes based on past patterns. The checklist remains, but the cognitive work migrates to the tool. The human is now confirming what the tool has already decided. If the tool is usually right, people learn to trust it. Trust is not irrational here. It is an adaptation to time pressure. But a new constraint appears. The reviewer's ability to detect the rare wrong case becomes weaker with every month of not seeing one. Humans calibrate to frequencies. If 98 out of 100 outputs are fine, oversight becomes scanning for the obvious outlier. But many of the worst failures are not obvious. They are plausible. Now the individual level failure mode. Individual failure mode, automation deference under time constraint. A person signs off because the system's answer is faster than their ability to verify, and because challenging it would require time they do not have, evidence they cannot access, or authority they do not possess. They do not feel dishonest. They feel practical. The signature becomes a ritual acknowledgement that the system has spoken. This failure mode is intensified by a common social penalty, being the person who delays. In many environments, the fastest path to conflict is to ask for more evidence. So oversight becomes not only a cognitive act, but a social negotiation, and the incentives of social harmony can beat the incentives of epistemic rigor. Now the system-level failure mode. System failure mode, accountability laundering through process. The organization distributes responsibility across many signatures and many steps, so that no one step carries enough weight to stop the machine, yet every step produces a record that controls exist. When a failure occurs, the system can point to the ceremony as proof of diligence, while the reality is that the ceremony was structurally unable to catch the failure. This is not a conspiracy, it is an equilibrium. Each layer can plausibly say, I followed the process, and each layer is, in a narrow sense, correct. Ceremonial oversight thrives in places where the power to decide and the duty to sign are separated. If the tool or upstream process determines the outcome, but a downstream human must approve it, you have created the conditions for ceremonial review. The downstream approver is asked to assume risk without receiving control. We should also name a specific kind of capture that looks like best practice. There is a subtle moment when compliance teams, quality teams, or risk teams begin to manage what can be proven rather than what is true. They must do this because audits demand artifacts. They are not malicious. They are responding to constraints. But the incentive shifts. The system is optimized for being legible to oversight rather than being safe, correct, or fair in the lived reality. This is where good intentions still produce capture. A well-meaning group implements stronger controls, more approvals, more mandatory fields, more checklists, more training modules. Their intention is to reduce harm and increase accountability. But the added friction increases the demand for automation to keep throughput. Automation then produces outputs faster, which increases the volume to be reviewed, which makes substantive review impossible, which turns the controls into rubber stamps. The controls become the justification for speed, and speed becomes the justification for automation. The system captures the intention and converts it into a defensible narrative. We added oversight. Meanwhile, the actual constraint, human verification, has been priced out of the workflow. Ceremony is not merely laziness. It is what happens when constraints are written into policy, but not funded in time, authority, and attention. Let's examine a common pattern. Sampling. When full verification is impossible, systems switch to sampling. Review 5%, review high-risk cases, review exceptions. Sampling can be a valid strategy, but it becomes ceremonial when the sample is chosen to minimize disruption rather than to maximize learning. If the incentive is keep error rate low on paper, the sampling strategy will drift toward the easiest cases, the cleanest cases, the cases that conform to the tool's strengths. The system will appear stable while blind spots deepen. Another pattern, escalation. Escalation paths are designed to route uncertain cases to experts. In a ceremonial system, escalation becomes a penalty. People avoid escalations because escalations slow down the pipeline and create visibility. Visibility can be costly, so uncertainty is hidden, not surfaced. The system becomes confident because confidence is cheaper than doubt. And there is a deeper paradox here. Automation can increase the surface area of decisions faster than it increases the organization's capacity to understand them. When decisions are abundant, humans must compress judgment into simple rules. The organization becomes reliant on proxies because it has too many outputs to understand. This is how ceremonial oversight becomes rational. In a world of abundance, the system values speed and legibility. Verification is neither. Verification is slow, context-heavy, and often cannot be summarized into a single number. One last tension, Responsibility theater versus risk ownership. Responsibility theater looks like control, signatures, approvals, trainings, and attestations. Risk ownership looks like agency. Someone has the authority to change the process and the mandate to do so when evidence demands it. Ceremonial oversight is what you get when theater is cheap and ownership is expensive. The oversight step becomes a prop when it cannot plausibly say no, cannot require evidence, cannot slow the process, and cannot change upstream behavior. If an approval step exists but refusing approval is punished, approval is not oversight. Ceremonial oversight has consequences that are usually second order. They do not appear as immediate collapse. They appear as gradual shifts in behavior, expectations, and the meaning of accountability. First consequence, the devaluation of attention. When the system treats review as a formality, attention becomes a scarce resource spent on appearances. People learn to allocate their limited attention to what is rewarded: completing steps, meeting deadlines, satisfying dashboards. Deep checking becomes a luxury. The system's culture quietly teaches that being responsible means being compliant, and compliance means producing the right artifacts. Second consequence, accountability without agency. As automated outputs expand, more people are asked to sign for outcomes they cannot influence. This creates a brittle kind of accountability. When outcomes are good, the system credits efficiency. When outcomes are bad, it searches for a signer. The human becomes a liability sponge. Over time, this discourages thoughtful roles, because thoughtful roles attract blame without authority. Third consequence, error persistence through normalization. In a ceremonial system, small errors become routine because they are rarely caught, rarely analyzed, and rarely fed back into the design. The system stabilizes by accepting a background level of failure as normal. Automation then scales that background. The error rate might look small in percentage terms, but absolute counts grow with volume. The system learns to live with constant leakage. Fourth consequence, the migration of expertise. When tools propose answers and humans confirm them, humans practice confirmation rather than problem solving. Over time, expertise shifts from people to systems and to the small group that maintains the systems. This is not inherently bad. Specialization can be efficient. The trade-off is that frontline reviewers lose the ability to detect subtle failures because they no longer exercise the relevant muscles. This makes the organization more dependent on the tool's internal logic and less able to challenge it. Fifth consequence, incentives reshape honesty. In ceremonial oversight, people are trained to say yes quickly and to treat doubt as inefficiency. This changes the local definition of integrity. Integrity becomes, I did what the process required, not I ensured the outcome was justified. It is a quieter erosion than fraud, and it is more common. Sixth consequence, capture by vendors, templates, and default settings. Whenever oversight becomes a set of steps, whoever controls the steps can control the meaning of responsibility. If a template defines what must be checked, the template defines what counts as safe. If default settings define what is approved, defaults become policy. This is capture without a villain. The system is captured by what is easiest to operationalize. Seventh consequence, the organization becomes legible to itself in misleading ways. Dashboards begin to replace investigation. Leaders see compliance rates and assume safety. Managers see review coverage and assume quality. The system becomes more confident precisely when it should be more curious, because the proxies are improving while the underlying meaning may not be. This is a trade-off, not a pure loss. Ceremonial oversight exists because some ceremony is useful. It coordinates behavior, sets expectations, and creates a shared language for how we do things. The danger is when ceremony becomes a substitute for verification. Eighth consequence, the hidden tax of friction. As oversight steps multiply, they add friction. Friction has an externality. It pushes work into informal channels. People create side agreements, shortcuts, and unofficial processes to get things done. The official system becomes a museum of rules. The real system becomes a network of exceptions. Oversight can only see the museum. The real risk migrates to the invisible. Ninth consequence, slow decay of trust. Trust is not only emotional, it is operational. It is the expectation that procedures correspond to reality. When staff discover that approvals are automatic, that reviews are perfunctory, that checklists are not read, they adjust. They stop relying on the system's claims. They rely on personal networks, gut feel, and informal reputation. This can keep work moving, but it fractures coherence. The organization becomes a set of private maps. 10th consequence: the ratchet effect. Ceremonial oversight tends to persist because removing it looks like removing safety. Once a checklist exists, deleting it creates perceived risk, even if the checklist is not functioning. So ceremonies accumulate. Each new failure produces another step, another sign-off, another artifact. The system becomes heavier, not wiser. And heavier systems generate more demand for automation, which increases output volume, which increases the temptation to ceremonial review. The ratchet clicks in one direction. These consequences are not prophecies. They are patterns that emerge when constraints and incentives are not aligned with verification costs. A key insight: real oversight is expensive in the currency that matters most: time, authority, and the willingness to slow down. If the system is designed so that slowing down is punished, then real oversight is designed out, even if policy says otherwise. Another key insight: automation changes not only speed but the meaning of a decision. When the tool generates a recommendation, the human's role can shift from deciding to endorsing. Endorsement is psychologically easier than decision-making, especially under volume. But endorsement without verification is not responsibility, it is ceremony. And a final trade-off: transparency versus control. More logging and more artifacts increase transparency in one sense. There is more data about what was done. But transparency can become a substitute for control when the organization confuses visibility with governance. Seeing the steps occur is not the same as constraining outcomes. The system can be perfectly logged and still poorly understood. So when does oversight become ceremonial rather than real? Not when people stop caring. Not necessarily when they become careless. Often it becomes ceremonial at the point where verification is structurally unaffordable, when the organization demands speed, scale, and uniformity, but does not pay for the attention those demands require. Ceremony is a social solution to a cognitive budget problem. If you cannot verify, you can at least demonstrate that you tried. If you cannot test every output, you can at least show a checklist. If you cannot understand the system end to end, you can at least record that someone signed. The hard part is that ceremony can be sincerely comforting. It provides a narrative. We are responsible people. We have controls. That narrative can be partially true and still misleading. A disciplined approach begins with questions that are uncomfortable because they point to power and constraint. Who has the authority to slow the process when uncertainty rises? Who bears the cost of delay, and who receives the benefit of speed? What forms of evidence are actually available to the reviewer at the moment of approval? What would it look like in practice for a reviewer to reject an automated output? How often does that happen? And what happens to them when it does? These questions do not provide clean answers, and they should not. The point is to see the system as it is, a set of incentives and constraints that shape what people can afford to notice. It is also worth noticing how quickly language adapts to protect ceremony. We start saying reviewed when we mean seen. We start saying validated when we mean not obviously wrong. We start saying accountable when we mean traceable. The words keep their moral weight while their operational content shrinks. And there is a personal discomfort here that does not require therapy language to name. Humans want to be seen as competent. In a high-throughput automated environment, admitting I cannot verify this can feel like confessing incompetence, even when it is merely stating a structural fact. So people perform competence by approving. The system rewards that performance. If you want a single mental model to hold this. Oversight is real only to the extent that it can impose a cost on the system when the system is wrong. If the oversight step cannot impose that cost, cannot slow, cannot block, cannot demand evidence, cannot alter upstream incentives, then it is drifting towards ceremony. That model does not tell you what to do. It does not promise a solution. It simply prevents a particular kind of self-deception, the belief that adding more proxies will restore meaning. Because the deeper truth is that verification is not a checkbox. It is a practice, and practice is always limited by attention. Attention is always shaped by incentives. Reflection, then, is not an attitude. It is the repeated act of asking what the system rewards, what it punishes, and what it quietly ignores. We can live with some ceremony. We cannot afford to confuse it with constraint. Proxies cannot love you back.